need to convene the leaders of this continent to talk about this visa story. This is a disaster. And let me just say the following. I struggle to understand why I can land in Paris, get on a train and end up in Brussels. But if I want to move from Joburg to Gaborone, I must produce a passport. Who's the genius that came up with the scheme? You know, the Europeans are so quick to tell us that we can't bundle ourselves into a single block, but they've done it. I'm sorry, can we just pause, just one moment, pause the time. Who designed this nonsense? I have a theory, and here is my theory. You only lock the vault where there is money. And so maybe there's a reason you've been kept out of that neighboring country. Maybe there's a reason you've been kept out of that neighboring region. Maybe there's a reason you can't travel to that other place, because if you were to, there is something you might do that would help us build what we all know we are capable of. So first, keep them away from each other. Second, convince them that they're enemies with each other. And third, convince them that the other one is better than the other one. And before you're done, they will hate each other so much you don't even need to pass policy or law.
Welcome to Wake Up Black. Educate and enlighten.
Imagine the cowards we must be to be born of forefathers who liberated our continent from colonizers, only for you and I to be broken down by a tweet. And so the question, I think, for our moment and for our season today is, do you have the courage to rise above a hashtag? Will your life be nothing more than a demonstration of somebody else's opinion of you? Now, what is interesting is this. Notice the means of the enemy. When he is well aware that you are on the path to your greatness, he makes the noise to distract you. I had a conversation with a brother in Christ of mine, Grace, and I was sharing this with him, and he said, you know, Vusi, it's something very interesting, but if you are a runner, an athlete, a marathon runner, say, and you're running on the track, and you're doing a 3,000 meter, 8 laps around a 400 meter track, he says, do you know what happens? I said, what? He said, each and every single one of the people in the grandstands has something to say every time you come around the grandstands. He says, but of course they have the breath to say something. They're not using their breath to physically exert themselves to achieve things. And so for those of us then who are quiet in the season, we are quiet because we are sparing our energy for the things for which our energy is called. We just don't have the time to do the things that don't matter. I think we're called on in this season as young Africans to seize power. To truly seize it. In the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without demand. And so therefore, if we want a better life for ourselves, we must demand of that power. And I often hear young people today say things like this. You know, it's time for young people to rise. It's time for the old people to move out of the way. It's time, it's time, it's time. Let me tell you, young people, there is no old person going anywhere. If you want that seat in that office, in that boardroom, in that chamber, in that ministry, you're going to have to fight for it, because power isn't given, it's taken. And so the question as our continent rises is, will we be men and women of courage? Will we be the generation in 50 years' time that our children reference and say, they did it right? They had the template for how to truly pull out of each other the ability to work with each other. And something fascinating is happening today. I must tell you this. This is the good news. The good news is that we're no longer separated. The good news is that we find each other. The good news is that in this room, there are people who are following Vusi Thembekwayo on Instagram. I know I'm very good looking on Instagram, I must tell you, I am very good looking on Instagram. But the good news is that even I have the privilege of following a Professor Lumumba's work. No matter where in the world I find myself, where there are Africans who are speaking, leading, evangelizing, and growing others, we now have the ability to find each other. The true question is, will we have the ability to build with each other? You see, to date, our building strategies all center on these borders that were drawn for us and not by us. And so it becomes the question of, is your nation thriving versus mine? I had this conversation with a friend of mine who also works in capital markets like me in South Africa. I said, I'm really confused by this feud we have with Nigeria. I genuinely don't understand it. Why do we constantly migrate to the global north, and South Africa tries to posture against Nigeria and Nigeria against South Africans? What's the game here? What's the gambit? Whom is it that we're trying to please, and against whom are we trying to please them? Because each time we find our leaders playing that game, the question perhaps we should ask is, who is the master you're trying to please? In this moment and in this season, I think as a generation, we are called to truly understand what it's going to take, one and all, to work with each other, but to build with each other. This is, I think, the generational mission of the platform. I said this to my brother, Pastor Pojo, the last time, and I will say it now here publicly, that what has started as the platform Nigeria, in my mind, needs to be the platform Africa. It needs to bring together leaders in various spheres and various spaces who are at the frontier of what it's going to take to truly take our continent to next, whatever next might be, and have them in a single platform sharing ideas about what next looks like. In my world, I spend an awful lot of time looking for investment arbitrage, an awful lot of time looking for the ability to buy X and sell at Y in a particular time period, and make sure that my risk, what we would call in finance your risk adjusted for the cost of taking that risk, make sure that you earn a return that is commensurate to what the investors are looking for. And often one of the things we do as investment professionals is, where we might lack the opportunity to find a true and meaningful arbitrage, is we will invent it just by purely looking at the various countries and citizens and the natures of those countries, and where there might be an underweighting one asset class of another. That is to say, rather than meaningfully creating and adding value, we're skimming off the top of the cappuccino and milking the froth. And every time you do, the investors are simply asking the question, is there froth, rather than, have you made a fresh cup of cappuccino? So in this moment then, and in this season, it's important that we unite, that we truly pull each other towards each other. I will say it here. I will unite with any man and woman to do right. I will unite with nobody to do wrong. Amongst our greatest naiveties, I think, is that we presuppose that in the world of good and evil, it exists a little bit like it does in the superhero movies. It's how we approach the world. There's a bad scenario and superhero flies in and saves things. And then forever and a day, things will be better after that. Reality does not mirror that expectation. In reality, most people are complex. Most societies are complex. The challenge for us is whether or not we individually can be a force for good, a true force for greatness. What I wanted to seek and find was to answer a simple question. What does it take for Africans to be great? It's a simple question. Now, because of the nature of my work, I went and looked for the actual thing that I could prove here, the scientific thing that I could go, statistically, if you do these things on a balance of probabilities, you will achieve whatever greatness is defined as for you. And here is what I found. I found that in every instance where there was a particular set of factors that made a population group or a citizenry or a nation achieve its goals, if you took those very same factors and plugged them into a different citizenry, the numbers would not tally. That is to say the following, that beyond strategy, beyond information, beyond policy, formations and conversations, all of which, by the way, are fundamental, there is a single truism that holds, an ingredient without which the coffee doesn't taste good, and the ingredient is this: choice. Do the people of those countries choose to be great? You know this is true, by the way, because there are a lot of choices we make as people that filter into just how we think about ourselves. When you say or hear people say things like, this is just how we do things in Nigeria. That kind of statement is often diminutive. It reduces us to the basic bare minimum and says, accept this because this is the standard. In other words, even though we could choose better, we choose what we just get. That greatness is truly a choice. If greatness is a choice, last time Pastor Pojo shouted at me for not having a presentation. I've got one today. There are three things then that I think we should all consider in this moment and in this season. The first, I think the era of demographics is dead. I think the era of framing ourselves by the tribe we come from, the background we come from, the place we went to, or how we were raised is moved. I think what we've become today is not just a demographic people. What we have become today is a psychographic people. We are connected in the way we think about the world, not just the way we exist in the world. And so today we find more commonality with each other because psychographically we see the world in similar ways. We aspire for similar. In other words, we are more alike than we think. If, therefore, we are truly to rise as a continent, then how we leverage this as a choice is going to be important. Side note, one of the things I think that's missing in this season, it's my own humble opinion, that is to say I might very well be incorrect, although I doubt it. One of the things in my mind that's missing in this season is a patriotic, flag-bearing, strong group, not only of men and women, but of Nigerians, who understand in the African context what Nigeria is. With the greatest of respect, I think in large part, the average is so distracted by internally what's going on. You're missing who you are in the global context of your continent. You're too worried about what's being said or who's japaying or who won the elections or what's next without thinking consciously about what you could do as an economy if Nigeria decided we're going to set the path for the rest of the region. As a consequence of this, absent of leadership, what happens? Everything that we have been seeing. And so the question for this moment, for each and every single one of us, is will we be the courageous men and women who recognize the season we are in? I'm not sure how many of us have traveled to my country of South Africa. Any of you here? Hands up. When you do, and I hope for all of you that you do, which, by the way, side note, a conversation we must have, and Brother Pojo, I don't know how we do this. We need to convene the leaders of this continent to talk about this visa story. This is a disaster. And let me just say the following. I struggle to understand why I can land in Paris, get on a train, and end up in Brussels. But if I want to move from Joburg to Gaborone, I must produce a passport. Who's the genius that came up with the scheme? You know, the Europeans are so quick to tell us that we can't bundle ourselves into a single block, but they've done it. When you publish this, you must just leave that part out because I'm busy raising money from them. You know, I don't know. They're going to say he's too radical. And so, even in my own native land of South Africa, the work as South Africans we must do is to conscientize each other about the continent. In my mind, and I was listening to your comments, ma'am, about the youth service, I'm seized to understand and failing to understand why we are not deliberately sending young people into other parts of the continent. Experience the culture, live with the people. To come here, to be here in this beautiful country, I had to go through Ethiopia. From Ethiopia, I was in Zambia. So I went South Africa, Zambia, Ethiopia, Nigeria. Between now and December, I'm going to be in about 8 different African countries. In that same time, it's going to be easier for me to do 5 different countries in Europe than it will be to do 2 different countries in Africa. Less layovers, less time. I'm sorry, can we just pause? Just one moment, pause the time. Who designed this nonsense? Who wrote the script? I have a theory. And here is my theory. You only lock the vault where there is money. And so maybe there's a reason you've been kept out of that neighboring country. Maybe there's a reason you've been kept out of that neighboring region. Maybe there's a reason you can't travel to that other place. Because if you were to, there is something you might do that would help us build what we all know we are capable of. So first, keep them away from each other. Second, convince them that they're enemies with each other. And third, convince them that the other one is better than the other one. And before you're done, they will hate each other so much you don't even need to pass policy or law. And in the middle of all of this, here we sit as young people, fruitfully connected by the HTTPS. And we're more worried about what's trending and commenting on it, rather than how do we meaningfully build with each other and do business. I came to tell you here today that I'm only interested in meaningfully building and doing business. I'm only interested in understanding how do we take the platform and put it in Johannesburg or put it in Cape Town. And how do we have not just this conversation here, but that conversation there? Because until and when Africa truly is of a single mind, it will continue to be the fodder and the meal for the rest of the global average. I don't know about you, but I would like a world slightly different for my children than the one I grew up in. So we must recognize then that our value to the world is cemented. And recognize beyond that, that even that very idea of what it is that is our value is changing. There are 5 fundamental ways value is changing. I'm going to spend a minute on them. The first is value is changing around how we think of our identity as Africans. The second, how we think around what is truly wealth as Africans. The third, how we think around what we're building as the next generational legacy as Africans. The fourth, this archetype of these binary ideas we've always had, they and us, recognizing that we operate as a single block and in unison. If we don't understand and leverage each of these value constructs, we are missing the fundamental layer that is layered into our society today. Just our identity alone. You know, 20 years I've been a speaker now, 19 this year. I became a professional speaker at the age of 19 years old. I'm 38 now. For half my life, I've had the incredible grace, by God's grace, of standing on platforms such as this and looking into eyes like yours. There is no part of my story that should bring me here. I don't come from a family of orators. I don't come from a family of means. I don't come from a family of wealth. One of the challenges we've struggled with in South Africa post-apartheid has been crime. I know this because my father was murdered when I was 13 years old. 8 times my father was shot for a cell phone. To this day, twice the case has been opened, both times the docket has been lost. Far be it for me, as a proud South African, to travel the rest of my continent and speak poorly about my country, but what it is I am trying to help you understand is there is no part written into my past that makes my present possible. And so it is not only then, but by the grace of God, but more importantly, because I was able to meet that grace with work and opportunity. That most of us in this room are simply denied that work and that opportunity. What could we do when we truly come together as a single block? A week ago, I was in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. Today, I'm here. I make it my intention to travel the continent. Because, and on this point I will end with this. You see, it's easy for a politician to lie to you about Pan-Africanism when you've never traveled Africa. They can tell you their version of it because they've never been there. They will tell you how Africans speak even though they've never been there. Which, side note, why do Nigerians add O to everything? I'm sat at dinner last night, and this young man I'm with said something so profound. I was like, wow, that's so good. He said, please don't take my words, oh.